This first question is for Father Brunner. What does the phrase, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, when it appears that Portugal is no different than any other part of the world? How does one interpret, protect, I'm not going to read the last part of it, or the last line. Yep.
How does one interpret properly this phrase? I think so. I think that in Portugal, the promise is that the dogma of the faith will always be preserved. So where do you preserve dogma? You preserve it in your mind and your heart, especially your mind. So no one promised that the clergy of Portugal would maintain dogma. Is that enough of the faithful, clergy or otherwise, and will maintain dogma. So since 1/6 of the nation, I'm told, still goes on Portugal on pilgrimage to Our Lady of Fatima and prays the Rosary, that the faithful who pray the Rosary will preserve dogma. And it will be notable that enough of them are there that it's not just an individual or something like that. It'll be seen as a fact, as a national fact. But that doesn't mean that the clergy or the majority of the clergy or any of the clergy necessarily will preserve dogma, but that some number of the faithful will. I presume there will be some priests, but judging from what some of them are putting up with and so forth, some of them will not, of course.
The next question is for John Benari. Comment how well poised. John, maybe you better read it. Might be easier for you.
Okay, it says, how well poised is our government to intervene and manage the economic meltdown, social chaos, citizen internment camps, expanded powers of the Patriot Act, chip technology implants, cell phone computers, monitoring technology, etc. Yes. Well, again, just recently, Obama made this, he gave this presentation. I think it had to do with supposedly at the time of honoring Ronald Reagan, was it? Something like that. In any event, he basically talked about a new legal framework in which they will imprison people who might commit a crime. It's preventive imprisonment, prolonged preventive imprisonment, indefinite. It's indefinite. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this MSNBC hostess, or maybe she's kind of a butch host, if you get what I mean, she was appalled by this, and she did a terrific job just slicing this lecture to bits. But she was very nervous about the fact that Obama is talking about preventive internment, preventive imprisonment for an indefinite period of time. She says, where does this come from? So it's what I talked about earlier today, that Carol Quigley saying that those who don't go along with this will represent the tragedy. And so there might be the need, who knows, I hope not, to get us out of the way through some sort of internment in these big FEMA camps that are being established. 40 years ago this would have been unthinkable. I don't think it's unthinkable now. All we need is a crisis big enough for them to say, look, we have to rid the streets of all, not only terrorists, but suspected terrorists, and of course, everybody in this room is a suspected terrorist, according to the Department of Homeland Security, because if you fear a communist government, or if you're against the New World Order, or if you're angry that the biggest plant employment, the biggest industry in your state or in your region or in your city was shut down and the job sent to China, if you're mad about that, well then you're a potential terrorist. So I can't I can't go into details if and how this is going to happen. I just believe it is possible, and that's one of the reasons why we need rosary crusades. We need rosary crusades to try to prevent this from happening, because our politicians aren't really doing much to prevent this. Most of the time, it's not even talked about. As far as the microchip technology, that does exist, that you're implanted with a chip, and basically you can be followed anywhere by this. A group called Verichip has perfected this. But as of last year, something came out, actually this was reported in the secular press, that it was found that these microchips, that they did a bunch of experiments on dogs, and they found that the chips were causing tumors in dogs. And I was very happy to see that stock microchip, Verichip stock just went plummeting down into the basement with no takers. But that technology is around, it's being worked on. It is something to be concerned about. There is a woman named Catherine Albrick who has a website, I think it's called spychips.com. Well, she keeps tabs on it, but it's one of those sites that's updated every 3.5 months. So, but you can get her book about spy chips, because a lot of these chips are being used already in industry. They're being put into, for example, shoes. These RFID chips are put in shoes, which means basically that they can be read by a reader, and people can know where you are, and they can track your movements. So she was on a campaign to get it out of anything that we wear or anything that a person buys. The microchips are used in shipping, because places like Walmart and places, these big box companies, and I guess, you know, wholesalers in general, they will mark the pallets or however it's done through these microchips, and it's a very efficient way of keeping track of where everything is at every moment. That's one thing. When they start to implant them on us through our shoes or through our video camera, somebody who has just suppose I had a $1,000 video camera and some hoodlum has a scanner. When I walk by and that video camera is in my backpack, he can scan and he can see the type of video camera and the cost, how much it costs, which means, dare I use the term, the left words, I am a potential victim. I'm a potential victim of a crime because he knows what I've got. He knows if it's in my car. So Catherine Albrick, pretty much single-handedly, has been fighting this to get this out of the consumer market. And I don't think there's much she can do to get rid of it in wholesale and shipping, but don't have it on our clothes, have it in our shoes, have it in our cameras, have it in our passports, which they are. They're now on our passports. I heard, I shouldn't say I heard, I've seen where you can supposedly buy these wallets that make it impossible for an RFID reader to read through and read your passport. I haven't purchased one because I have no way of verifying if these things work. I mean, somebody could sell me anything, and they say, yeah, this will prevent the, oh, yeah, okay, well, yeah, here's $50 for it. You know, if I had some way of testing it, I think I'd buy one, but until then, so they could sell me anything, and there's people out there who would. So I hope that's some help to this question.
Dr. White?
I have 3 things here that I'll deal with. The third I'll ask Father Gruner to comment on as well. But let me start with this, since this is my real area of expertise, and this shows up over and over again. Someone asked, who was William Shakespeare? Having taught for all those years, many, many sections of Shakespeare, course after course, it was about the first question always asked, who really wrote the plays? Fact is, they were written by a man named William Shakespeare, who was born in 1564 in Stratford to a devout Catholic family. In fact, the family held to the old faith, who got himself into some trouble at the age of 18 and had to marry a shotgun wedding, and his first child was delivered 6 months later. But we know he was married by a Catholic priest outside of Stratford. The banns were only read once because it was a hurry-up situation. There are then the missing years. He then shows up in London and has a great success in the theater. We're not sure where he was in between times. Very successful in the theater, highly honored by his friends, his colleagues, and the public. It's very clear now, people had assumed it for a while, but now it's very clear he was a hidden Catholic in London. I think he went through a crisis of the faith. And if you read Hamlet, I think you can see the doubts assailing the man. He had a terrible crisis that he dealt with, got through, and then came back to the faith stronger than ever. And especially the last four romances that I'll speak about tomorrow make very clear he was a Catholic. Now, where does this come from then? Well, for 250 years after he died, while he lived and after he died, the question was never raised. It began here in America. It started here. And it was a woman named Delia Bacon who decided her ancestor, Francis Bacon, he wasn't her ancestor, they just shared a name, had actually written the plays, went around trying to convince people of the case, actually went to Stratford to dig up the grave and wasn't allowed to do so, and then broke into Trinity Church one night with a pickaxe and shovel to dig up the grave. And she went about the rest of her life trying to convince people. Of course, since then, the other candidates are not just Sir Francis Bacon, but Christopher Marlowe, the Earl of Oxford, Queen Elizabeth herself. It's crazy. Yes, Chaucer, who, of course, like the Earl of Oxford, apparently could write plays after he died. The Earl of Oxford's the hot candidate right now that these people pick up on. But he died, I think it was 1606, and Shakespeare produced a good 6 or 7 plays after that. So if that's the case. And the Earl of Oxford published poetry under his own name that stinks. It's very odd you'd publish poetry under your own name that's no good, and then under a hidden name publish works of genius. It's utter, absolute nonsense. There is nothing, I can assure you, as someone who has studied the subject for 45 years, a man named William Shakespeare wrote the plays. By the way, we also know that he received last rites at his death. He retired, he went back to Stratford, where a Protestant minister wrote to a friend, enraged, "Master Shakespeare died a papist," meaning it was well known the priest had been there at his bedside when he died. So, second question. What do we make of certain traditionalist writers who defend the Vatican by saying or implying that L'Osservatore Romano statements that I cited are the fault of the new editor of the newspaper and not the Vatican? The questioner says it seems these traditional writers are making excuses to protect the negligence of the Vatican. Let me give an analogy. I don't want to be here to criticize the Vatican. Well, I guess I have. But I'll just let what I said earlier stand. I will say this. I worked as a civilian for the Navy for nearly 30 years. There's a way a hierarchy works. It's authoritarian. If someone does something outrageous, the superior officer is responsible. And what you do, if it's really outrageous, that superior officer must immediately get rid of the underling who has either stepped out of line, done something inappropriate, and then the higher official in the chain of command always takes responsibility for what's happening below. That is the way any kind of authoritarian system works, and the oldest and longest running one in the world is the Vatican, and therefore the superior must act and take responsibility. That's all I'll say. One last quick question. Why would a pope refuse to follow Our Lady's requests when he knows he will stand in judgment before her son? I can't say what's going on in the souls, hearts, and minds of these popes. I can't know. But I can know this. All of us, every one of us who live in the modern world are fragmented. One of the definitions of modernism is we are shattered people who have to live in different ways at different times. The one thing that we are not capable of being anymore is integral human beings, where all the parts fit together and we are one and the same person all the time through our lives. It happens to all of us in some ways, some major, some minor, some more, some less. One of the things that popes now have to deal with overwhelmingly is the whole question of politics. Politics is the new religion. It's the reason why I would guess more Americans on Sunday mornings watch the political talk shows than attend the real Mass. And that's because politics is the new religion. It's everywhere now, it's saturated everything, and one of the things that the popes have to deal with, political questions, they're very important, and I think they are afraid to make certain moves politically because of political ramifications. I find that odd myself, but I can't put myself in their shoes and pretend to know what's going on there. But I think that's one reason. And also because, let me say this, being modern, and we all are, we cannot escape it, all of our faith is weaker than it should be. All of us, try as we might, given the conditions we live in, the world we live in, and what we're going through, our faith is not what it should be. That certainly may be true of many churchmen as well as many of us. And what we do, therefore, is pray, 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 because when it finally happens, it will be the grace of God through Our Lady that allows a pope to do the consecration. Father probably would like to say something more about
that. I certainly agree that, first of all, we have to pray, and it's Our Lady's victory also. We must remember that it's she, and I think there are 3 stages to this victory or this triumph. Our Lady tells us that. She says, in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. First of all, by saying in the end, it's after a struggle. We've had some 90 or 80 years of struggle so far. We haven't got to it yet, although, as I told somebody yesterday, I didn't mention it today, is that we see some signs of that struggle coming to an end. We're not there yet, but Pope Benedict himself has mentioned more than once, privately and publicly, about the consecration of Russia. He has said he's actually had Cardinal Bertone go to the Russian Patriarch. Now, apart from my opinion of whether he should do or not do this, the fact that Pope Benedict asked or told Cardinal Bertone to go to the Russian Patriarch and ask how they would feel about it if the Pope did this consecration of Russia. The very fact that the Pope, thought about it, even without talking to anybody else, he thought about it, number one. And the second thing is he's actually talked to somebody about it. He's actually asked his Secretary of State to ask this question. Now, that's not enough to get to where we have to go, but it's further ahead than any other Pope I've heard so far. And that's not, as I say, enough, but the fact is he is thinking about it. The fact is he's wanting to do it. Secondly, on May 13th of this year in Bethlehem or Nazareth, wherever it was, when he said, was it? In Bethlehem, our Lord, or rather the Pope said, I hope that Our Lady's promise for the world peace will be granted. He's obviously acknowledging by that question that it has not yet been granted. Unlike the propaganda, basically, that came out of the Vatican for the last 25 years, saying the Pope did it, he did it in 1984, and so let's not talk about it again. That's been the official party line over and over again. Well, that party line seems to be coming to an end. That's again a sign that there's some change. And therefore the Pope is... Now, is that enough? No. But these things come about. I might want to comment on how a hierarchy works and how a hierarchy should work, and sometimes does work, which is, we have the famous example of when the third secret was not released in 1960, John 23rd made the decision not to release it. But however, how it was not released was done as follows. He had, the best I can determine, his personal secretary leak it to the press anonymously. So why would ANSA, a well-known press agency, international press agency, state in public, in a very short quote that went around the world, saying, according to anonymous sources, why would they believe these anonymous sources unless the person giving this anonymous message was credible to that agency. And so it's been more than one person, I think, that's told me that it was actually Archbishop Capabilla, who was the Pope John 23rd's personal secretary, who gave the message. So sometimes when they want to do something, they are less than, you would say, forthright in taking responsibility. And so that's what I think has happened. The same thing with the Mass, the Latin Mass, was done by Paul VI. But he let people understand that he had commanded that the new Mass be said and the old Mass not be said. But the fact is, nowhere can you find such a document. And when he was asked directly to his face by a priest, he said, I never said you couldn't say the old Mass. Because he knows he couldn't, but he also knew he wanted to impose it. So they did it by this indirect mechanism. One of my primary lessons I learned in theology was not in my first year of theology in Montreal. The lesson in canon law that was not on the course was what happened as follows. In early January of 1967, there was a letter published by the Chancery Office saying that you could not promote a certain private revelation in the Diocese of Montreal. So that's what the letter seemed to say. So I read it a second time, and I recognized that actually, when you read it carefully, it didn't say that. But it seemed to say that. But I didn't stop there. I went to the Chancellor, the Vice Chancellor of the Diocese of Montreal, and I said, Monsignor, this letter seems to be forbidding something in the diocese. However, when I read it a second time, it doesn't do that. Now, did I understand this letter correctly or not? Now, his answer was the most instructive answer I've had for something that's outside the courses. And it really is instructive about how the church is being run quite frequently, which is, he said, you have read it correctly. We wrote the letter that way. In other words, they wanted to convey the impression of an order that you are forbidden to do a certain thing in the Diocese of Montreal, but we will not take responsibility for that order, and so we're not really giving you that order. But we want you to believe we gave you that order. Now, this is really an example of schism, okay? And what does schism mean, or schism, is the word which means to break unity. Now, normally people understand schism to mean that a person does not respect or recognize the authority of a bishop or a pope. And that's true, it means that. But it's the larger sense of the meaning of the word is that it's to break unity. And authorities can also break unity of the church. Because with this letter being published, I didn't know my mother read it. Not that I should reason, because I didn't know how wide it went, and we never discussed it. But 5 years later, my mother and I were discussing something, at which point at some point she said, well, Father, I wasn't ordained then, you yourself are not obedient to the authorities of the church. I said, what is that I'm not obedient in? I said, well, that letter that Montreal put out saying you can't promote the such and such of a private revelation. And I said, well, I told her then, I read it, and that's what the letter said. I asked the authority himself, and he said that's what we meant to say. But you see, she had a judgment against me for all these years because she thought I was being disobedient. Now, it was a very small thing, in a sense, compared to, that's exactly how why do we not have people coming to the Latin Mass today? Because most Catholics think, until recently, that they were legitimate in going to the new Mass, and that they would be illegitimate to go to the old Mass. And it's all been carried off by the same stratagem. And that's caused a schism or a break in the body of the church between members, faithful members. And so I've described this in my book about, if a man had 10 sons and he told 5 of them, or even spoke in such a way as to tell 5 of them, paint this room red, and he spoke in such a way as to tell the other 5 of them to paint the room green, then if they all went about to obey their father whom they loved, and they ended up fighting with each other because one thought that they had to paint it red, the other thought they had to paint it green, you have a disunity in the body of the church, all caused by the superior. And that's what's been going on in the church. And that's why, in turn, I have people even telling me, even from the podium, that I've been told not to speak about these things, that I've been told not to talk about the consecration of Russia. I had a very well-known speaker in my first conference in 1992. Now, he's being interpreted, and I thank the interpreter for not passing that on. But in reading the text, he said that I've been told by the authorities of the church. I have never been told such a thing. Because having a little bit of knowledge of law, the fact is, if they gave me an order, I'd ask for it in writing. And if they gave me this order in writing, I'd be able to publish the order. The reason why an order, a formal order, has to be in writing is because every authority has to take responsibility for what he commands. And so if a pope were to tell me to stop writing about this, I'd ask for it in writing. And if he wouldn't give it in writing, the order doesn't stand. If he doesn't give it in writing, I would say, well, you see, I've got an order. He's now responsible for hiding this truth from you. And you do what you have to with it. The whole point is that unlike a subversive society, which bases, well, the Masons or other secret societies, they will not take responsibility. Authority, first of all, you don't know who is in charge. They never identify themselves. Secondly, when an order is given in such an indirect way, you never know who gave the order in the first place. Whereas in the Catholic Church and in the state, if it's run according to the laws of God, according to natural law, is that the public authority has to take personal responsibility. It's I who said it. I take responsibility for what I said. I gave this command. I have the authority to give the command. And I don't got to hide behind anything. But when you have a subversive order, it's given so that people don't know who gives the order. And that's what we have, unfortunately, in a hierarchy today, even we have that. Anyway, hopefully I've gone over time on that question. But the question here is, do I think that Cardinal Ratzinger, now the Pope, has any regrets for his participation in Vatican II? I don't know. But certainly I see that he's doing certain things which the secret has told him is a problem. One, it being the Latin Mass. Two, again, it's not enough. And I think he's also not giving communion in the hand personally. And it would be even better if he told all the other priests not to give communion in the hand also. I'm not here to criticize him not doing that. He's doing more, and I understand he's a very practical man in the sense that he doesn't feel he can do beyond a certain point. Is he right in that estimation, or is he wrong? That's another question. But the fact is he's doing something in the right direction. But at the same time, can we undo Vatican II? Is that possible? Well, ultimately, yes, it is possible. We say, Our Lady says, in the end, I don't think that we've reflected upon, I do talk about this tomorrow, but in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. So the first triumph is over the heart of the Pope. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia. That's the first triumph. The second triumph is, when Russia is consecrated, Holy Father consecrated Russia to me. Russia will be converted. That's the second part of the triumph. To be converted, of course, conversion can only mean one thing in a Catholic context: conversion to the Catholic faith. And it's not just conversion to the faith, but to the fervent practice of that faith. That's the real conversion. And then she says, and a period of peace will be given to the world. Now, if you analyze, how can you have peace in the world without having the Prince of Peace being enthroned as recognized? Christ is the Prince of Peace. And therefore his doctrine, his social doctrine, not only his spiritual doctrine, but his social doctrine will be enthroned in the world. You can't have peace without following the doctrine of Christ, the Prince of Peace. And you can't have that without the whole world being converted to the Catholic faith. And therefore, yes, you'll have the Second Vatican Council overturned when you have peace in the world. And it will come through the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Second question, considering most of our bishops will not cooperate in the consecration of Russia, isn't it likely that the consecration must take place only when a few bishops remain alive? Well, that's one solution, but it's not the only solution or the only necessary solution. You see, all it needs is for the Pope, first of all, I think you need to know several things. I write to the bishops. I try to write to them 12 times a year. I get correspondence from the bishops, and it's one reason why I don't think the Vatican wants me to talk to the Pope. Because I know the bishops. First of all, the majority of them would consecrate Russia. I've had bishops tell me that, even bishops who say, I don't agree with you, and you cannot quote me, but if the Pope told me to do the consecration, I would do it. So there are the vast majority, the only bishops that will not do the consecration, they're less than 10 who have the courage of their conviction to write me a letter. And some of those are dead. So that there's that much opposition. And this is one of the lies that the Secretary of State has told John Paul II for years, is that the bishops won't obey, so you can't give the command. But let's just take for the moment that my information is wrong and your information is correct. In which case, as Father Caillon said in 1971 or thereabouts, all the Pope has to do is give the order under pain of either demission of office or excommunication. So if any bishop will not obey, he's not a bishop anymore. He doesn't count. And therefore you get 100% of the bishops. And the only bishops that would not have to obey would be those who are impeded from doing so by either physical illness or by being imprisoned or something like that. In other words, God does not expect them to do the consecration, that individual bishop, if it's physically impossible for him to do it. And therefore the excommunication would not apply to him, because you can't excommunicate a person unless he's committed a crime. But to not obey this command would be a crime. And the Pope has the power to do that. And the First Vatican Council does say that quite explicitly. It doesn't say you can excommunicate bishops, but it's there in the doctrine of the Pope being in charge. And this is one of the things, I think, why God has insisted that it be all the bishops, because the Pope has to give the command. And the bishops have to obey. So quite likely he'll have to give the command in that form. But most of them won't need that. But if there's a few recalcitrant ones, then they won't be bishops anymore. But other way, other than that, and I think that those, maybe I've counted up to as many as 25 at one time, but I don't think we have 10 today left who have the courage of saying it to anyone that they wouldn't do it. That's the next question. Now, next question here. This is regarding Normandy. Let's see if I stay on the same subject before I get to that. All the 1/3 of the stars of heaven, does that mean we have 2/3 of good priests still? Well, Father Kramer is of the opinion that that may be, but many of them are still in much ignorance. Doesn't mean that therefore they still need to learn their faith better, because obviously not all of them, in the case of the Novus Ordo, for example, understand the significance of it. But yes, you can say that judging from their hearts, judging from Scripture, that 2/3 of them are in the right direction, but may not be necessarily that they're, because they've had, don't forget, 40 years of error over time. And the seminary formation, as John is pointing out. Now, regarding Normandy, since the tide had turned on the Eastern Front in 1941 after the Battle of Stalingrad, and the US and British had quite a difficult time battling up the Italian peninsula in 1943, how could the US and UK have battled over the Alps to beat the Soviets into Germany and Eastern Europe? Well, I'm sure you all know I'm not a military commander, and I'm not. I did say the opposite of that in my talk, and I believe there are commanders who would believe the opposite, but I couldn't argue the point. I would say this, though, that Hannibal himself went over the Alps, not once, but several times. So it's not impossible to either enter or exit Italy over the mountains. And of course, Hannibal's capacity is world famous, even though it was done over 2,000 years ago. The other thing I would say is that if you ask the question the other way around, a cui bono, to what good did the war take place? If you take that dialogue, which I referred to, but I didn't give you the quote, and I don't have it here, it's an evil man, an evil mind speaking, but part of the thing, if you understand your enemies, you can also understand their tactics, and you can also protect yourself against them. When you listen to the dialogue of this evil dialogue of how Stalin will be enhanced and ensconced, the Battle of Normandy and Yalta all ties in with it. Whereas, had they used the forces they had and the beachhead they had, Stalin could not take the East. And yes, when you take MacArthur, for example, not just going by land, but hopping over by sea as well as land, I'm sure that MacArthur, they got together, they could talk, they could use the same tactic possibly, I don't know, to go from Italy to hobnob over to Yugoslavia and go up as well and open the next second front there. Why in France? Why not do it some other place? And why is it that the British and the French made a treaty with Poland which said, we will protect you, but they only applied it when the Germans invaded, but they never applied it when the Russians invaded. It all fits into the same strategy. Now, maybe tactically this doesn't work going up Italy, I don't know. But overall, yes, it was pre-planned. It was to give Russia half of Eastern Europe, and they did it. And they did it on your backs and on your money and with your dead. And that's how it was done. And that's because we're believing our government leaders and all the rest of them rather than believing the Blessed Virgin more. And putting our faith, our true faith in Our Lady and our Lord would be the answer. And if we keep on believing their lies and everything else, we'll keep putting ourselves and putting our hands in the noose and getting ourselves locked up and killed because that's what they want of us.
Thank you very much.